So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Inspirations number 2. As you know, this is a series of lectures sponsored by Fosters and Partners. And we have here with us today, Simon Sturgis, with an amazing lecture called Architecture and Carbon, What Should We Be Doing? You know that this is the third activity in a row linked to the COP26 in Glasgow. So we wanted to also work together with that huge initiative. And this is just the final lecture attached to this activity. As always, these inspirations has a dynamic of a lecture or of around 35 minutes. Then we will have a longer discussion with students and staff and all the guests that are attending this session. As you know, we want the guest, the speaker, to be really focused on their speech. So you can just write your questions on the chat and we will take care of that and curate all of them for the end. During the lecture, we encourage people to turn your cameras off, and we will turn them on for the discussion at the end. So I will now give the word to Laura. Laura is from the Climate Change Action Group, students group, very active, I must say, at MSA, and she will be leading this conversation, this session today. Bye, Laura.
Thank you so much, Jose. Yes, my name is Laura. I'm an architecture student in my 3rd year, and I'm also the co-lead of, as Jose already mentioned, the MSA Climate Action Group. We're a student-led group here at the MSA, raising awareness on the interconnection between the built environment and also the climate. So I would like to welcome our guest for this evening, Simon Sturgis. Simon has over 30 years experience as a built environment professional, and he's also the founder of Targeting Zero, the carbon consultancy. And Simon has also been working on practical assessments of resource efficient and also low carbon design for the past 10 years. And I just wanted to kind of like mention 2 of my favorite kind of like buildings where you actually assessed on, Simon, which is the Google HQ in London. Big fan of that one, and also especially the Cork House, really innovative. So if you guys haven't looked into that, they make some great precedents, I would say. So yes, without further ado, Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Jose and Laura for and all of you for inviting me. I've been really looking forward to this. So I'll just try to take possession of the screen. So I'm hoping you can see what I'm seeing. I'm going to start off, in fact, with I'm afraid, a slightly dull picture, which is this one. But it's making a pretty important point. So if you can hear barking in the background, that's my dog, because somebody's letting off fireworks outside. But so what this image is showing you is the relationship between the carbon dioxide concentration and temperature. And as you can see, it goes back 800,000 years before the present. And you'll notice that CO2 concentration and temperature kind of basically follow each other around. But if you look at the top right there, you can see what's happened in the last 100 or so years. So each of those peaks is roughly every 100,000 years or so. The main peaks on both. And you can see what's happened. We've actually, in fact, we're now over 400 parts per million of CO2. So you can see why there is a sort of genuine concern and why we're having the things that we're having happen, because CO2 is out of control, and it therefore seems likely that temperature is going to be out of control. So, you know, the objectives of COP to try and stay within 1.5 degrees are extremely serious and are linked to carbon. So, of course, as I showed you from that picture, this goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Of course, we in this country kind of, if you like, invented, or to some extent invented, the Industrial Revolution. And so we have a particular I suppose, responsibility. And this is a picture of Victorian era Britain. And of course, this is what's happening as a consequence of all of that in California, where we're getting forest fires and other places all around the world. And of course, also the opposite, the destruction of Greenland glaciers and so on. And I'm sure you're familiar with all of that, but I thought I'd just preface that. So what is interesting is you look at this magazine here, which says Extinction on the cover. And if you read down below that, it says what's now at stake is nothing less than everything. COP26 cannot become another vanity exercise because hope is eternal, but time is not. Now, the interesting thing is that this is not something published by ACAN or Extinction Rebellion. This is published by the Financial Times Weekend magazine. And for those of you who are not in the financial services sector, the Financial Times is it's published as a weekday newspaper on pink paper, as it happens, but it is read by the financial services industry. It is read by, people at the top of governments and the top of finance ministries and all that kind of thing. But this magazine here, and this article was only about 11 days ago, 31st of October. So if that sort of magazine is trying to talk about extinction as a real issue, then we can see that this is a major problem, and is something that is not just restricted to us and people living and working today in a regular way. This is global, and it is obviously significant that this kind of organism, if you like, or magazine is publishing this. And then if I produce this is also from the same newspaper. So this is also from the Financial Times. It says here, we can't get to net zero by flipping a green switch. We need to rewire our entire economies. Now, this was said by somebody called Mark Carney, who was governor of the Bank of England. So he was in charge of all our money. And this is what he is saying. So if you like, if he's the arch sort of money man, capitalist, what do you want to call him? And he is saying we need to rewire our entire economies. What does that mean? And I think for me, what it means is that the model on which our society works from an economic perspective is broken. It's not just, as I say, people like Extinction Rebellion pointing this out. And this is not somebody from the left of politics. This is a central banker. This is the man who is running our money. He's saying we need to rewire our entire economies. And if I just give you an explanation of what that kind of means. So this is obviously a map of Brazil, and it's showing the logging. Now, GDP, gross domestic product, is the measure by which nations sort of compare each other in terms of financial success. And what happens is that when you, say, chop down trees like this, they generate a degree of financial benefit to the nation as a whole. But of course, what is left out of the equation is the fact of destruction of natural habitat and the impact on the climate and the natural environment generally. That is treated as irrelevant. And therefore, the way we measure nation to nation the success of relative success of nations is fundamentally flawed. And I think coming back to that point about, the model is broken, this is kind of why we need to, when we measure the success of nations within themselves or whatever it is, we need to actually say the money is not the whole thing. We need to be looking much broader than this. And this is really just explaining again how this is over the last 20 years, the deforestation has gone from 20 years ago, 82 million hectares lost, to nearly double that now, and I'm sure will be double in this coming decade. So this is massive and significant, but it is a function, obviously, of, as I say, the way we look at societies and measure their success. But of course, it's also down to the people on the ground, the people living in Brazil. They benefit financially from this, and of course, we've got to create a new model which also enables them to benefit. And maybe it's more about health and well-being. It's about happiness. It's not about how many dollars you've got in your pocket. And if we look at what politicians have to say, well, the politician on the left has recently become a sort of enthusiast, probably because he wants to be best friends with Joe Biden. But as been said by the politician on the right, blah, blah, blah. And why aren't we seeing real activity, real change? And I think the politician on the right has got a far better handle, obviously, on what's going on and what should be happening than the one on the left. Now, this is what the government has committed us to as a nation. And whether you agree with it or not, what they're saying is that we need to be net zero by 2050. And I'll come back to what does net zero really mean. But it also is saying we've got to be 78% reductions by 2035. And that is only 13 years away. Now, if we look at, if you just bear those two figures in mind, because I'll come back to them. So this is a global figure. The UK is slightly different to this, but in essence, what this is showing is that building operations and building materials and so on are responsible for, in this diagram, about 40%. But of course, part of transportation and part of industry also contribute to that. So the figure's probably bigger globally than is being represented here, although in the UK, the proportion is reckoned to be slightly less. So, make that of what you will. The point is, it's a significant part of it. And the impact of building, construction, the use of buildings and all of that is a real issue. And of course, the people behind Insulate Britain are trying to do their best in terms of fixing these kind of issues, particularly building operations. Now, one of the things I'm involved with is something like the Whole Life Carbon. It's called the Whole Life Carbon Network, which is I chair it. It's a group of people. What we've done recently is try to define what net zero means. So we've produced definitions. We're trying to get better consistency in whole life carbon reporting. And what that is leading to is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, the whole life carbon assessment in the built environment, the document that's been produced by the RICS, that is in the process of being updated. And what this is all about is improving the way we calculate embodied carbon, whole life carbon. And of course, if you measure something, you can then understand how you reduce it. That is the objective. So if I talk about what is net zero, so a net zero carbon asset or building is one where the sum total of all asset-related greenhouse gas emissions, both operational, i.e. energy, and embodied, i.e. materials, are minimized, meet local carbon, energy, and water targets, and with residual offsets equal zero. So what this is saying is all carbon emissions related to building need to be brought down, and then with residual offsetting equals zero. So I'm going to come back to that residual offsetting thing. So if you look at this diagram here, on the left, you can see the makeup of a building, and it's the the energy and carbon emissions over a 60-year period. So you've got primary structure at the bottom in dark blue, you've got services in red, then cladding, interior fit out, and energy in use. So all of that added all together, that's what it costs over 80 years in terms of carbon emissions. And what I'm saying here is that certainly 20 to 30% of that can be reduced for zero cost and really easily. None of that is difficult. You can knock off 20 to 30% quite easily. You just have to know where to look. But what this is also saying is that if you get that 20 to 30%, which is, again, quite a small proportion of the total column, the rest is offsetting. And by 2035, on the right there, you can see 78% of that gray column has got to be offset, and the full amount has got to be offset by 2050. So that's a lot of offsetting. But if you look at these people here, these are the Indigenous Environment Network. These people are not happy about carbon offsetting because carbon offsetting has a lot of consequences. And it's also, in a sense, ducking the problem, in my view. There are people who sell carbon offsets who have very good explanations as to why it's a good thing. But I think it's to some extent masking the problem. And if we take account of what the Indigenous people and so on are concerned about, we should be really carefully thinking about recommending offsetting in any way. So this next couple of slides is all about existential crises and architecture. So these first four images are from World War I, so 1914, 1918, last century. And they represent the sort of destruction that was happening at that time. And if you go on to this is what came up after the First World War. So within only a few years of that, within a decade of the end of the First World War approximately, you're getting a new architecture, which is radically different. And I'll come on to a slide which explains it, but it's very different from the previous architecture, the pre-First World War architecture, the end of the 19th century. And that architecture that is evidenced in these images has really come out of the demands of the day. But of course, is, as I say, very different to what happened before. Now, if you look at this, this is a similar set of photographs, but this is World War II. Sorry, it says World War I up there, but it's actually World War II. And you've got kind of destruction of places like Coventry, Stalingrad, Dresden, and then on the bottom right there is London. In fact, that is London Wall, which I'm going to just show you another image of. So again, you've got a sort of similar level of destruction of humans and buildings. And of course, as I say, this is a kind of existential crisis. And this is what came out of it. So we built, all these things were being built as a result of destruction. And this is what the 1960s London will look like. Now, if you think about this, the reason, what caused these cities to be destroyed was, of course, people like us flying bombers and shelling each other and so on. So the image on the left is really representing the way the cities on the right became like that. This is the destruction as a direct result, and it is what has created, if you like, or was contributing to the existential crisis in the 1940s. And of course, you could say, well, that today, the consequence of climate change is leading to the kind of destruction we're starting to see that is beginning to mirror, not necessarily as extensively, but potentially far worse than what happened during either of those two wars. And if I go on another step with that, so what this is saying is that the construction that we're having today is contributing to climate change and is directly contributing to the stuff that's going on in the image on the right is contributing to what's happening in the image on the left. And therefore, you can make the direct correlation to say that building buildings is not dissimilar in terms of existential threat to humanity as driving a bomber. And that may seem a bit extreme, but I think you can draw parallels given that given the fact that construction and building and the built environment is responsible for something like 40% of global emissions. It is not an unreasonable point to make that there is an equivalence, if you like. And I know I'm kind of stretching a point and sort of collecting up dots that are loosely affiliated, but I think there is a point to be made that the seriousness of this is such that there is a level of equivalence. And if you look at the nature of the problem, what this is saying is that global construction to 2020 to 2060, so for the next 50 years, equivalent to one new Greater Manchester every 9 weeks. So if you think about that, that is a phenomenal amount of construction. And that is, again, what we're having to deal with. Now, you might say, well, we have to put a stop to that. But yes, we have to retrofit, and I'll come on to this in a minute, the retrofit issue in a minute. But I think also we have to recognize that population is growing, whether we like it or not, and population is part of the problem. The population is growing, but and consumption is growing, and people need to be housed, people need to have somewhere to go and work, and so on. So whether we like it or not, buildings are going to continue to be built, although, as I say, we want to be retrofitting. So what do we do? So I've got a few things here which are very simple, but kind of just summarizing some key points. So reuse and retrofit. So clearly, we want to be prioritizing retrofit. And this on the left, there's a sort of classic sort of warehouse, Victorian warehouse, which is being retrofitted. And on the right there, you've got the image on the inside. And it's not just the whole building, it's also materials and what have you. You reuse, refurbish, recycle, retrofit. Now, this is an image of a building I was involved with, which you can see on the left there, the building as it originally was, and you can see on the right there, the building as it now is. These slides are not quite true because actually the sites are different. And what I was involved with was a scheme where the client wanted to demolish the building on the left and throw it away and build a brand new building on this site. But we persuaded them to dismantle it, hence the image in the middle, and then rebuild the building on the new site. So we took it apart, moved it along, rebuilt it. And that was cheaper in cash terms. it was lower carbon, and it was quicker. So, what's not to like? So I think this is a kind of, if you like, refurbishment in terms of moving the building from one place to another. So these sort of things can be done. This was for a regular client. This is the kind of building you find on the outside of cities all over the world, but it's the kind of thing that was crucial. Obviously, recycling things like aluminium is very important, and things like the coating. So, for example, on the left here, you can see a picture of powder coating of an aluminium sheet, and powder coating is a sort of baked on sprayed paint, if you like. Now, if you anodize aluminium, you have to have the same aluminium. So it has to come from a mine, a bauxite mine, somewhere like Australia or wherever, because if you use recycled aluminium for anodizing, you tend to get color variations and so on. So so what I'm making the point here is that a coating, something as simple as a coating, a choice of coating can make a difference to what the substrate is, and therefore whether something's recyclable or recycled or not. So it is really important to think about this again holistically. It's not just about the finish, it's also about how you get there. I thought I'd just show you two things I'm involved with. We're fighting demolition. So the building on the left is an existing, not a particularly nice building, it has to be said. It's a travel lodge. It's due for demolition, and in fact the owner of the site wants to demolish it and put the building on the right there. And I'm working with the I'm against the developer. I'm working with the local community to try, and I've been putting together quite a lengthy but a carbon-based argument for keeping that building and not letting them build the new building on the right, which is proving really interesting. And there's a clear case to be made. But people have to change their mindset as to, and it comes back on that point about changing the economic model. We also need to change our mindset about these sort of things. This is a similar thing. This is a different building. But what we're trying to do here is explain the difference in passenger, between a new build and a retrofit, the carbon cost in relative terms. So this is, the difference in terms of air miles, car journeys, and trees planted, and so on. And the one at the bottom there is about the different carbon footprints of the different schemes, and therefore how we can argue against them. So the other thing, of course, is the long term, and fundamental to understanding the carbon impact of a building or a collection of components that go into making a building is the life cycle. It's not just what it takes to build it; it's what happens after its life. And what this diagram on the left there is showing is, how many replacements do you need over a life of a building? Is it durable? Do these things, do bits and pieces fall apart? On the right there, you've got the blue showing sort of things like lease cycles, when do lease cycles change? And the sort of yellow tone is because of climate change, that, as time marches on, temperatures increasing and so on. So it's really thinking about that at the design stages. How do we factor that in? How do we future-proof what we're doing? And this diagram is really trying to explain how the carbon impacts of a new building. So if you look at the green column, so this is aggregated every 5 years. So the first above zero, you can see there's a green column there. So that is the construction, the upfront construction emissions, what it takes to build the building. So those stay static, obviously, as you go on. And then you'll see the pale blue is the energy in use, it's the operational carbon emissions. So it's energy in use, gas, all that kind of thing. And obviously those get added to year on year, and of course they go up year on year because this is cumulative. The blue bars are cumulative. So at year 20, for example, you've got quite a high-ish blue bar, which is going up because every year you're adding more to it. Green bar stays the same. And then the pink one is the in-use embodied. So that's replacing and repairing and maintaining bits and pieces. Now, what's interesting about this is if you build a building today and you go forward, let's say 30 years to 2050, you can see that the embodied emissions are still a greater proportion and more than the energy in use. So this is making the point that if you're concerned about emissions today, i.e. reducing the carbon impact of our buildings now, you've really got to reduce those green emissions in particular and the pink ones. And one of the ways you reduce the green ones, obviously, is to retrofit, because that green bar then goes down to, I don't know, a quarter or a third of the height. And you can see it then becomes much less of an issue. So the other thing about it, of course, is durability. I'm sure you recognize this kind of thing. This is a Victorian terrace house, which people quite like because they are endlessly capable of variation and adding and changing. And that, I think, is a good typology. I mean, many contemporary built homes just do not lend themselves to this kind of change and adaptability. And bearing in mind, these houses in this image are, 150 years old, probably. That's pretty impressive. And how many current or recently built housing schemes would be expected to last that amount of time? This is another point, which is really making the point that we should be designing buildings that are capable of adaptation to other uses. So, whilst the building on the left might be winning prizes and things, actually it's probably pretty useless for anything other than a design museum. The one on the right is a design museum, but it's capable of being used because it's pretty simple boxy construction. Can be used as almost anything. I mean, you could change it into a variety of different uses. I think that's quite an important thought. Material use. So this is really making the point that, we're building these buildings on the right there, which are, 3 sheets of glass, complex glazed facades, which only last about 40 years, 30, 40 years, because double glazed units, laminated glass does not last very long. Whereas a brick facade is an expensive carbon thing to make, thinking of that step graph I showed you. But on the other hand, it does last for a long time. So unfortunately, there's no easy instant solution. All of these things require balancing out different things. Now, the one on the left, I happen to know, has a timber frame, has a completely timber CLT internal skin. So it starts off as a timber building, and then they wrap it up in brickwork. So that helps to some extent. Methods of construction. Now, this is showing about modularity and so on, and the ability to disassemble important. But some of the modular construction can be useful and can have good things, but doesn't always have good things. So you have to, unfortunately, you have to do your assessments and figure these things out. Holistic thinking. This is really about not just the performance of something, but also about the carbon cost of it and the life cycle. And then the form, the complicated shapes, lose heat, cost a lot more in terms of carbon and so on. And this one is really about natural ventilation, that the combination of materials and energy in a building it's not just about the energy, it's not just about the materials, it's how those two things interrelate. So and this point here, I'm going sort of on because I know time is ticking on, and I've got just a few more to do, actually, not too many slides to do, 4 or 5. So this one is actually the Google headquarters in London, which I was involved with. And what is interesting about this is that we found on I think virtually every single tender package that the carbon cost and the financial cost were the same package. So in other words, there isn't a problem with embodied carbon being wildly expensive. It's just not the case. It is the case that there is a correlation between, I wouldn't say it's 100%, but it is a clear indication that carbon and money follow each other around. If something's expensive, then it's probably high carbon. If it's cheap, then, well, cheap's a bad word to use. If it's inexpensive, maybe it's not so bad. So just some final points about sort of the architectural issues. So this is really just talking about, again, referring back to what I was talking about at the beginning. So over these 2 houses you see here are 20 years apart. And the one on the left, 1908, and the one on the right, 1928. And of course, in between the two is a war, an existential crisis, and the destruction generated a complete change of thinking. And that crisis generated a change of thinking. But if you look at architecture today, for the last 65 years, if you look at these 3 buildings, the one on the left, 1955, has a single skin facade. The one in the middle has double skin or double glazed units, double skin facade. And the one on the right is 3 sheets of glass. So, does that represent exciting innovation and change? And I would argue that maybe all of those anyway are obsolete under today's climate crisis. And if you look at something like cameras, a camera on the same period, 1955, 1970, 2020, you've got a huge evolution in thinking. And my question is really, why aren't architects doing the same thing? Why haven't we evolved to the same extent? I mean, interestingly enough, just a side point, of course, is the camera on the right. That has a computing power of that one camera has the same computing power as the whole of Europe did in 1955. So, that's an expression of progress, if you like, which is not happening, I don't believe, in the same way in architecture. So this is my second from last slide. And it was my last proper slide, I suppose. So this is really saying, well, what is the architecture we should be having for the climate crisis? What will it produce? Is it like, is it going to be a significant amount of retrofit? It should be. We should be using a lot more reusing a lot more buildings. But what is it going to be otherwise? Is it like, the Cork House or Archetypes Enterprise Centre on the bottom left, which are made, being very innovative with materials, very low carbon. I mean, interestingly enough, that thatch wall probably has a similar lifespan to an aluminium panel, which is kind of extraordinary to think about. And the one on the right, Hayworth Tompkins, is a combination of retrofit, reuse, recycling, and new construction. And finally, a plug for my book, which is from RIBA Publishing, which came out a few years ago, but I'll finish on that one. So, yeah, thank you very much. If anybody has questions, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Simon. Amazing presentation. A little bit scary, which maybe it should also be, to see kind of that we haven't really properly learned out of anything, and the buildings kind of all look the same in a way, and don't really function. I do have a question for you. So it does seem kind of like you said already, in terms of the cladding and everything, it does seem like it's a very kind of like thin line between what is recyclable, sustainable, carbon neutral. So would you say that that is kind of like one of the reasons, together, of course, with economic factors and also maybe the aesthetic, kind of like modern looking, which makes it so difficult for kind of like people and also architects to kind of wrap their head around, like has sustainability become too complicated to implement and also uphold?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think I think where we are is if you look at the sort of, there's a learning curve going on, and I think at the moment most architects, and I'd include the sponsors of this session in this, is that most architects don't really understand what it is, what carbon assessment is all about. It's actually not enormously complicated in practice, because what you're doing is you're taking material quantities, which you get from a QS cost plan. You're taking material quantities, you're multiplying them by a carbon factor and saying that's what it is. Now that's a sort of simplification, but you can get, I mean, for example, Field and Clegg Bradley Studios will give you, you could get free software or free Excel spreadsheet actually from their website. And it's worth just downloading that and just messing about with it, because it'll give you an understanding of it. But I think where we need to get to, I mean, if you ask most architects to draw a beam between 2 points, they will draw something which is kind of roughly right. They won't know exactly because, but they'll draw something approximately right. And the reason is because we've got that sort of intuition, which we developed over time and through experience and so on. And what we need is to develop a carbon intuition, which is to say that we need to be able to sort of default and know that certain things will work and certain things won't. But until we get to that point, we've got to do the sums. We've got to do the assessments, and something. There are exotic software tools out there, but I would really recommend going for either the Field and Clegg Bradley Studios one or Hawkins Brown. I think Hawkins Brown, called HBERT, is free, but I think they've got they're starting to charge for a more exotic version. I don't know, but certainly the Field and Clegg Bradley one is definitely worth looking. They're both worth looking at, but the Field and Clegg Bradley one is still free, I believe. But they're not difficult to use. They're worth messing around with because you get a flavor of what's involved. And we just need to know, like I mentioned about aluminium. you just need to, until I got involved in this, I would happily specify powder coating or anodizing with the same level of enthusiasm. I had no kind of, if you like, carbon intuition as to what the difference between those two things were. But now that I understand that, you understand that those are the sort of questions you need to ask. Where does this thing come from? How's it made? And of course, it's not just about carbon. I mean, those sort of questions also raise issues of, ethical sourcing and toxicity and what have you. So we need to ask these sort of, be much more aware, not just say, oh, well, it's the contractor, it's the supply chain and somebody else is responsible. Unfortunately, a lot of the way buildings are bought is part of the problem, which comes back to my point about, the way economics is working. So, you buy buildings, it's quite often design and build where the architect does the drawings, then the contractor just chooses everything. But, we're not powerless. We can influence things. And I think increasingly we need to, if you like, embarrass clients into doing things. And I think architects need to really take a much more of a lead in this, in my view. I'm an architect.
Thank you, Simon. That kind of also leads me to another question, which Colleen actually asked in the chat. Colleen, if you would want to come onto the floor and maybe ask your first question.
Hi there. Yeah, sure. So thank you very much for the presentation, Simon. It was very, very interesting. But I was also curious a bit if there are any easier ways to make people understand that climate change will eventually destroy us if we don't do anything. Because I think that right now graphs and charts and slides work, but at a very, very slow pace. So what are we doing wrong and what should we do now?
I think that, this is a monumental question, isn't it? I think we have to scare the politicians. I think, I think they need to realize that they are toast, literally, if they don't get into this. I'm advising a parliamentary committee, and it's good that they want to know, but it is also quite frightening that they don't know what they should be knowing. But they're learning. But I mean, I've been talking to a number of government departments, and it is quite frightening, given that the government has required this, these targets. And again, people can argue about the targets, but that the government departments who, as I say, the government's produced these targets, that they most of them don't have a clue about what this is about. The way this can be made to change, I think, is basically democratic action. I mean, friends of mine moan about, Insulate Britain clogging up motorways, but I think actually what's wrong with that? I mean, I think that, we should be producing action and we should be trying to force, politicians to listen. I mean, my choice is to go down the kind of, if you like, the empirical route, which is to help provide guidance, help provide evidence, and enable people to make the cases. But I think, we all have to do what we need. I mean, if you want to go up and march with Greta Thunberg, then that's great. But I think we have to, we also have to recognize that it is a fundamental change. And I've talked about, fundamental economic change, but it's also a personal change. And I'm not really a particularly good example, but, I think everybody's lives are going to change. We have to recognize that. And I think if you think about the change from the agrarian sort of, between 1600 and something and 1750, 60, 70, 80, we were an agricultural economy, and we've had a massive change moving to an industrial economy. I think we are facing that level of change, but we just don't know it. But I think what we need to have is that in 20, 30, 40 years time, we need to be living different lives. My children, grandchildren, same with everybody else's, need to be living a very different life to the one we live today.
Thank you very much. I think I could also come in with my next question, just to build up a bit upon this, because I was also wondering, so just to understand a bit, last week we had an interesting talk, and we kind of got this idea that a lot of materials, natural materials, could be used, are more beneficial than what are we currently using, but there is no market for it. So I was wondering, how can we create that market for more natural materials that could be used by developers, architects, and contractors to make them understand that these are more affordable and better for the environment? As an example, we talked about sheep's wool, and that it can be a very good insulator, but nobody uses it. And because there's no market for it, farmers just burn the surplus. Is there any way we can make them understand that this can actually work?
Yeah, I think, I'm aware of various things where there is research and development going on in this kind of thing. I think it's got to be demand driven. If and I know Manchester's got a new carbon policy for, planning policy, and London has also got a planning policy, which I co-wrote the guidance for it. But all of these things put pressure on the money, i.e. developers, to do something, because they have to submit things, which puts pressure on the design teams, which puts pressure on the contractors, which puts pressure on the supply chain. So, but equally, architects who are kind of in the middle of that thing, we should be pushing upwards and downwards and saying to the design team, to the supply chain and contractors, what have you got that we can do with this? I mentioned Field and Clegg Bradley, I just happen to know them quite well. They do carbon assessments. Most of their clients do not ask for it, but they do carbon assessments on every project as a matter of course. So they actually plan out this, and it's not expensive for them to do. It's not silly money or anything. And they've developed their own tool, but so it can be done. But I think, talking about actually on the subject of wool, a friend of mine actually was involved in producing and marketing wool insulation for roofs. Unfortunately, what he discovered was that this stuff became like a moth hotel, and the moths took up residence big time in this insulation in his roof, because he used his own house as an experiment. He found that the whole roof was actually full of moths. So, of course, the way to deal with that was to spray it with chemicals. And of course, then you're back to the beginning again, because you don't want to be spraying it with chemicals. So, there is a kind of interesting issue, but it does take research, and it does require people to, you can legislate for that, and you can get government to grant stuff. And I think, there are sometimes grants available through Innovate and so on. But yes, you're right. I mean, that there are natural materials. Basically, the reason why natural materials are good is that they are replaceable, if you like, environmentally free of charge, whereas, certain things are not.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. And I think another interesting question that will help the discussion move forward is one that Catalina asked. So Catalina, do you mind turning on your mic and camera to ask it?
Hi, thank you, Colleen, and thank you for your talk. I was wondering, because the current economic crisis actually relies on the current economic system. I was wondering, how can architects challenge the current economic system, and what can we actually do about it? Would it be helpful if we actually offer our services at a lower price, so that sustainable buildings are more affordable for everyone?
I personally don't see why architects shouldn't be paid properly for what they do, particularly if they are offering stuff which is really important, if you like. I think, if it becomes, and let's face it, architects don't get paid particularly well anyway, but if we are having to do research and thought about these things, particularly in the first instance, then we should be able to fund that, of ourselves. That would be my first thought. But I think in terms of the bigger picture, I think, it becomes like it needs to become sort of viral within the profession, if you like, or allied professions. We need to make sure that other architects are engaged with this, that people we work with, like engineers, are engaged with this, that our clients are engaged with this. And, something sort of not particularly exciting, but important, I think, is a kind of business case, is so that when a developer or a client says, well, why should I get involved in all this stuff? It's just going to be a nuisance and cost me money. We need to have an answer for that. We need to know why actually reducing carbon emissions from construction and, over the life of a building is in the developer's interest. I mean, some of the things I've mentioned to you about durability. Now that means that the building is going to last longer and cost less to operate. Well, that can't be a bad thing. It must be a good thing for somebody who keeps the building. Obviously, if you're a developer who's buying a building and then selling it, well, then that's different. But, some of the big developers I've spoken to are thinking about, when they buy a building, they're thinking about making carbon one of the criteria that they look at to buy a building. So that means, is this going to be a carbon hungry building or not? And if some of the more enlightened, I know developer kind of tends to be a swear word, but some of the more enlightened developers are acutely aware that actually the value of the buildings that they're building or refurbishing is tied in with how people perceive them going forward. And if climate change is the game in town, they want to be sure that the financial value of that building is going to be consistent and not just drop away. I mean, some of those glassy buildings I showed you, I'm pretty convinced that within 10 years, those will be massively reduced in value because they've done something stupid. And actually, I've been advising a particular bank who I won't mention, but they want to build another big glassy building. And I've actually left the project because, they want to build a big glassy building. And I've said to them, this is spectacularly stupid, not just in climate terms, but also in your own economic terms, because in 10 years' time, you won't get tenants for this building because, any tenant, people are like, I mean, Bill de Blasio, who's the mayor of New York, has threatened to ban all glass buildings. Now, he won't, I dare say, but it makes the point that actually people like him are realizing that, where the problems lie. So I think these things will take time, but I think, it's a question of reaching out sideways and vertically and so on. And saying but it's also, as I say, creating a case for people like clients. Why should they do this?
Thank you very much. This is actually more positive than the atmosphere we had so far.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Continuing maybe with Mina, who asked a question about technology. Mina, if you would want to come onto the floor. Show your face, or alternatively, I can ask. Okay, no problem. I'm just going to ask it for you. So what can we do to develop to the level of other technologies, like the camera example you gave in architecture? And that may be also kind of like tied in with a lot of solutions, high tech and low tech. What should we kind of use? What is the best? Is it maybe both? Is there kind of like going that way, or is it kind of like a two-way street?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that I don't know whether, well, certainly when I was at the AA, one of the sort of phrases that were chucked out was from Mies van der Rohe, which was less is more. And I'm guessing that really that another way of looking at that is less is still more, but it's in a different way. I mean, that we need to, and I think there's a philosophy that's emerging here. I think the sort of low carbon design philosophy an all-encompassing kind of approach to buildings. I mean, some of the examples I showed at the end there from archetype. Either of those sort of direction. And I think that out of this will come, and people like Wolf Thistleton and others, I think out of this period will come a new architecture, and it needs to, because we're in trouble if we don't. I've been told not allowed to use swear words on this, so so anyway, but we're in trouble if we don't. And I think that what is interesting, and I showed those two images of buildings before and after the First World War to make the point that innovation is highly possible when we've got somebody putting a foot on our necks. And, you know, Corbusier's Villa Savoye was so different from what Lutyens was doing. And today we don't have that shock, if you like, or short-term shock. We have a sort of low speed shock, which is just not vicious enough at any one moment. Well, it's not vicious for us living in this country. I mean, it's pretty vicious if you're living in Sydney or parts of California or Greenland or what have you, or the Maldives, or, you know, these people are going to be in trouble pretty quickly. And we need to recognize that. You know, we're pretty safe in the UK, but I mean, one of the possible outcomes for us in this country is that the Gulf Stream stops functioning. And if that happens, well, our climate is going to be like Moscow's, because we're on the same latitude as Moscow. So, you know, we think we're all safe and stuff, but it is a slow motion car crash. That is the problem. But I think that, you know, I kind of quite often draw the comparison with Kodak. Now, I don't know how many people remember Kodak, but Kodak used to make camera film. Remember that? And Kodak, you know, there wasn't a shop in the world you couldn't go into which sold Kodak, that didn't sell Kodak film. What happened to Kodak? Well, they didn't change. They did not change with the times. And I'm talking digital, obviously. They didn't change with the digital evolution. And now Kodak make a few odds and ends. But this is the same. You know, if people who and companies who don't get with the program, if you like, who don't evolve fast enough, or those who do will, you know, they will be the next generation of, you know, Apple and probably, you know, so on. But they'll be doing it in a different way. It'll be climate related. And so the same is true of architectural practice. I mean, I've helped a number of architectural practices, and interesting enough, it's the commercial ones who want to change faster. The ones who think they know about it all, they think they know it all. Actually, you know, the commercial ones realize that there is an economic imperative to changing the way we do things. I don't know if that answers the question, but anyway.
Yes, it does. And that also kind of goes into the next question, kind of like this being detached from the actual problem because we're not close enough to it, that Hugh actually kind of raised. So in your second question, Hugh, if you would want to ask that question, that would be amazing.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. First of all, I really enjoyed the talk and it was really inspirational. Thank you for this.
Good,
and
you.
Sort of, yeah, my question comes from the idea of making people aware of climate change and what can happen. So do you think there is a way for architecture to evoke climate change awareness in people? And as you were previously also talking about, I think someone asked about the charts and how you make public aware using charts and rising temperature graphs, for example. Do you think there's a way for architecture to just make people realize how big of an impact an individual has on the environment?
Yeah, sure. I don't know whether this is quite answering your question, but one thing that worries me slightly is that, particularly because of COP and everything, is that it becomes like a temporary fashion or fad, that, you know, climate change, carbon reduction become, you know, this year's thing, you know, and everybody's going to worry about it. And, you know, in 2 years' time, they're buying the new whatever it is, you know, and they've forgotten about climate change because that was like 2 years ago and it's not cool anymore, whatever, you know, whatever you want to. But I think it's trying to embed it in the way we do things. I think, you know, rather than saying, oh, we're going to have a you know, I think it's got to become part of the way things happen. And this may mean that architects kind of become, how to kind of put this? I mean, okay, let me try and use an example. So if you look at Victorian housing, which probably was largely un-architect designed, you know, Victorian housing in London, Manchester, Glasgow, Edinburgh, well, no, maybe not Edinburgh, but anyway, you get the picture, is all very similar. and it, you know, consisted of a sort of typology that happened time and time again, but like the one I showed you. And there wasn't a kind of an ego behind those. It was a typology that people understood. It was easy to build, easy to make, and it was kind of rolled out because it was a formula. And maybe what we need to be doing is, and I know this is not kind of exciting and cool in the sense of winning prizes, but maybe what we need to be doing is coming up with a kind of a low carbon formula that is a kind of typology that is just something that we make, you know, and is not a series of, because I think where we are today with architecture is very much, and you know, things like the Stirling Prize, which I've had some involvement with, but where the Stirling, you know, people, you know, it's the exceptional and very, which is right, the exceptional should be kind of rewarded, but these tend to be kind of one-off buildings that are very, very bespoke and particular. And I suppose what I'm saying is that maybe the bespoke and the particular is good if it is leading the way to a generic typology, if that makes sense. Whereas if it is rather like that Vitra design museum, you know, which is, you know, weird and wacky and what have you, but is it really helping us get anywhere? And I suppose it's sort of, maybe mundane is good. I don't know. I mean, that's a rather dull thing to say, but, you know, maybe that's what we have to be, you know, aiming for, you know, and in a way, I think there's a sort of beautiful creativity about it. I mean, you know, reusing old buildings or existing buildings is very ingenious. I mean, before this session, I was explaining to Laura, when I had an architectural practice, you know, we did what was then called refurbishment, which was not cool at all. Whereas retrofit, of course, is fabulously exciting. But you know, what was interesting about that was you know, you could actually do some really quite amazing things with an existing building, but it didn't photograph well because it was all under the bonnet. And it's that kind of ingenuity that I think is still is obviously always important, but it's kind of look no hands. It's sort of, you know, it's not saying, well, we're going to have a lot of exotic things on the, so, you know, this building stands out as being supersonically amazing. I think maybe it is more about saying, well, this building is special, but it's quietly special. I don't know, maybe the Smithsons or Cedric Price was more in kind of that sort of territory. I don't know. So I never really liked them at the time, but anyway, there you go. I was more of a Rem Koolhaas sort of person.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much. That's a good way to think, and yeah, I'm going to consider that in the future.
Amazing. Thank you, Hugh. Kind of tying on to this question, Angela, if you would want to come onto the floor and maybe ask your question, which kind of ties into Hugh's.
My question, I need to remember it now. Oh yeah, so my question, in a way, I think Simon's maybe answered it in part, but I was wondering, you said this phrase around, you know, architects need to shame the clients into kind of embracing with this stuff, and I was just thinking around, well, what good techniques, approaches can you share with our students? I guess in a way you've answered it partially with that access to data, making the business case, but I think just might be worth sharing any more techniques.
Yeah, I think we need to I think we need to know more about the bits and pieces that we pull together to go into a building. We need to know, you know, that we have to upskill actually. We have to know more about the materials. I sort of alluded to this sort of earlier on in the talk, that we need to know more about where materials come from, how they're made, and so on. And that enables us, when we're having a conversation with a client over whether we use this or that as the component for the building, that we can say, well, this one is lower carbon, but it is also no more expensive because we already know that, and it's also available. We've figured that one out, and so, you know, it's a no-brainer, because what typically happens, of course, is we choose something as an architect, and the contractor then, because he doesn't know the person supplying it, or he doesn't, you know, he's got his mate that supplies something else, they say, oh no, if we go that route, it's going to be more expensive. It's going to be late. It's going to delay the program. All the usual sort of scary things that contractors say because they don't want to do something. So we have to know that. I mean, one example of that was, local sourcing. I mean, on one particular project, the contractor was going to all these default favorite suppliers, and yet there was somebody around the corner of the site, which is I forget where it was now. It's sort of near Warwick, I think. And there was a perfectly good supplier of things, but they were local, they were smaller, but they could do the job. But it was only because we'd dug around and found them, and then basically because they were slightly cheaper, bullied the contractor into taking them on, that we they became part of the project. But that's why I'm saying we unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, it's a good thing, but we need to arm ourselves. We need to have the tools to challenge contractors who want to take the easy way out. They always go to their, and there's no complaint about contractors. I mean, contractors are fantastic, but we need to get much closer to how things are made, to the supply chain, to we need to preempt, we need to research, if we're going to build something in a particular locality, we need to figure out what can we get in that area? What can we get that's recycled? What can we, we need to do those things rather than, I mean, I certainly did this as an architect. You think, well, I've designed a building, just get the contractor to find it, all the bits and pieces. Well, that is no longer going to be good enough, I don't think. And coming back to the point about the question about being, reducing pay, I think if we're doing those sort of things, I think we need to continue to be paid appropriately. And be sure that the client will make as much money as he can out of it. And if he's making money out of it, then, I'm talking commercial, then he should be paying us anyway,
Oh, great, thanks for that answer. It's research, and make yourselves.
If only the answers were easy. I mean, or rather, if only the way to solution was easy. But unfortunately, well, I think it's a good thing. I think upskilling and getting our hands dirtier is all part of the process. And we can't sort of glide our way easily to a better carbon future. We're going to have to work a bit.
Thank you.
That'll be more interesting.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. And I think there's another interesting question that kind of ties in nicely. It was from John, but I don't think he's here anymore. So I'm just going to ask it for him. So does the lack of progress in architecture compared to product design come down to an absence of standardization, i.e. we lack the economy of scale, which is required to justify that level of development? And so should we architects embrace standardization?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think the answer is probably sort of yes in a way, but not necessarily, to the extent of to the exclusion of everything else. I mean, to give you an example, I was talking to somebody about, in fact, this is a house builder. This is somebody from a developer called Igloo, who actually, on the side of the angels. But he was explaining that people like Barratt, what they do is they like to buy, as you were suggesting, they build houses all over Britain, and they like to buy everything by by the mile or whatever. So they like to have their supply chain sorted out so they can get everything at the most competitive price. Now, unless they've got factored into that, the sort of low carbon thing, they're going to buy stuff which is not in the right place. But if they can be persuaded, by regulation or tax or whatever it is, to do better and to position themselves, then yes, they could, rapidly improve, because the buying power of somebody like Barratt on housing is such that it will generate innovation if they ask for it. But they need to be made to ask for it, if you like, because why would you take the risk? If you're a developer like that, why would you take the risk? If you're building tens of thousands of houses, why would you not go to something that is going to work? So, you know, you need innovation, but then you also, so you need to create the environment for innovation and change and experimentation. But equally, once that happens, then, you know, the idea of it becoming embedded in the process, and it kind of follows on from the point we were talking about a bit earlier about, you know, the mundane or the replicable, that, you know, maybe that's not such a bad thing, but we need to have the right mundane, if you like, rather than the wrong mundane. I don't think it should be mundane. I mean, that's the wrong word to use, but, you know, it needs to be, you know, the right sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Simon. Two more questions. So one question asked by Han, if you actually want to come onto the floor and ask it yourself.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, he just said, ask for me, please. Okay. Do you think that the shock we can create today may not be on the appearance, maybe on the energy performance or technology and materials? Maybe it's just not that visible.
Yeah, I do. I think, you know, that's definitely part of the equation. You know, I don't see why not. I think, and I think things like I mean, it takes time, but things like the sort of, as I mentioned, the Sterling Prize, things like the Sterling Prize are starting to evolve to reward schemes. First of all, they're going to reward schemes that are, I think, have a proper whole life carbon assessment. I mean, I tried to get that involved about 5-6 years ago. But the other thing is that they're now going to be checking on buildings several years after they've been completed. You know, are they really doing what they say they do? Because, you know, it's all very well saying, well, this is a wonderful building, but if it turns out to be a rubbish performer, well, then, you know, you take the prize back. Is there any money? Do you take the money back? Maybe you do, I don't know. Anyway, you certainly take the prize away.
Amazing, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think for the last question, I'm going to invite another student, Eugene, to ask his.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering, why aren't there any policies right now that regulate total embodied carbon indexes of buildings, like how GFA gross floor areas are being limited compared to buildings? So I think what we mentioned before is we sort of we praise or we award buildings that are built well, but why not we penalize buildings that were not built well? I think that might be like a more effective way. Yeah, I think that if I got the gist of your question, I think I mean, okay, so this is a rapidly evolving thing. I mean, if you take energy analysis, which goes back to the 1970s oil crisis, things evolved over time and so on, and there's regulation, what have you, built up over that. Where we are today is that we've only relatively recently got a methodology. At the moment, what's happening, you've got the control of these things at the moment is purely down to planning in some areas, and it's not uniform. And secondly, there is no building regulation. I'm part of a group trying to get something called Part Z done, and Part Z is a building regulation for whole life carbon. In fact, you can look it up, Part Z, on the if you Google it. But what we're trying to do is create a building regulation that covers embodied carbon and whole life carbon. We've got a draft on the website you can have a look at, which is pretty thin at the moment. But the idea is that we create a regulation for that. Now, whether that leads to things like taxation, I don't see why not. I mean, I don't see why there shouldn't be a carbon tax. And I think, you know, coming back to the issue of offsetting, I think that in a way it'd be better to penalize people for not getting close to absolute zero, rather than to say that by offsetting, they can get away with it. Now, one of the things that, I mean, the person who sort of leads Letty, Clara Bagnall George, who I know well, what she's in favor of is that if you are using fossil fuels, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you cannot claim a net zero building. So you can only claim net zero if you're A, not using a lot of fossil fuels, B, you get down as low as possible, and then C, you offset. But again, it comes back to the offsetting, and that picture I showed you, is offsetting the right thing to do? I think if it is producing a positive outcome, then okay. But I think it is better to reduce carbon emissions. You know, I sort of feel with offsetting, it's a bit like, you know, if you throw a stone through a window and you break it, and then you go and fix it, you're kind of back to square one, but are you really? You know, you're not really back again. But I think, you know, some form of carbon tax, and funny, you know, oddly enough, the government, who used to say that this Conservative government used to say we don't like taxing people, we want to lower taxes, now are desperate for money. I think, you know, if they wanted to combine raising money with going green, what better way than to tax people who don't do, you know, low carbon construction, for example, or low carbon product making of any sort, because you know, any product can be assessed for its carbon footprint. I mean, an environmental product declaration could be required for every product made in the country. It's probably a bit extreme, but I mean, you could do that. So
thanks a lot, Simon.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think, yeah, the issue seems to be more complicated than we thought, because yeah, people might still like find loopholes that they could get away with it. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, this is the problem, is that unfortunately, this is an inexact science at the moment, and probably will always be. I mean, I was talking to somebody about, you know, energy assessment, and they say, well, you know, even though we've been at it for 40, nearly 50 years, it's still an inexact science. I mean, SBEM models and SAP models do not turn up with the same answers. But arguably with embodied carbon, we should be able to do better, because when you finish a building, you've got a collection of materials stacked up on site. You should know what the building's made of, and you should be able to track down what has happened to get there, if you have the will. But anyway, yeah. So, you know, I think it just needs, you know, needs a bit more maturity in the assessments and so on.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Simon.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Simon. I think that was all with the questions. And Jose is here to wrap it up, I think.
Thank you very much. So, Simon, I really enjoyed the presentation, and, well, of course, the questions and the answers. It's also really helpful for us from a teaching perspective, because it's really a challenge for us to change the way we were taught, to change the way we are teaching, and being more inclusive and able to well, make a synthesis of all this with our tradition, which is always great. I think you gave us well, very good ideas to implement in our programs, and I really appreciate that. Now, so really valuable input. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm glad it was useful. Great, well, thank you.
Thank you. So now I'm going to hand over to Jonathan. He will explain next week's activity. And yeah, so over to you. So I need to allow you. Oh, I don't know why. Just a moment. We had some.
Hello, everyone.
Let me close my.
Just use. Okay. Hello, everyone. Sorry, we've got some sound issues here. Okay, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me now. Sorry about that. Just some sound issues, as me and Jose are literally sat right next to each other. So thank you, Simon, for that crucially important presentation. So this is just a final quick announcement to everybody that there will be no MSA Thursdays next week. However, in its place, in conjunction with the Manchester Society of Architects, the Urbanistas Northwest chapter, and MMU, the MSA will be hosting Carol Patterson from OMA in person next Thursday, 18th of November at 6 p.m. in Chatham 312. And we will be sending out further information tomorrow on how you can register for this free event. So this is just to say there is something happening, and please save the date. So we look forward to seeing you in person next week. Please join us in thanking Simon in the chat. And if you'd like to turn your cameras on and give us all a wave, and we'll see you next time.
See you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.